Everyone, good to be back. Just realized my camera is really dirty. Let me see if I can fix that. That's better. Well, good to be back here and good to be starting a series on Exodus together. Um, I love Exodus. I think it is a good book of the Bible. Yeah, it really is one of my favorites, just because really of the message that I feel like it presents. You could say a lot of things about the book of Exodus and what it means because it covers a lot of ground. It starts with Israel um, in Egypt as slaves, and then it goes all the way through the Red Sea with Moses. You get out into the wilderness, Ten Commandments, the law, uh, etc. And then there's a tabernacle, which feels very dry to a lot of people. So there's a lot happening in this book. But like I say in my introduction to you, I think that there is a theme. And I read this book here. It's called The God Who Makes Himself Known. I think this is a wonderful little book because subtitle is The Missionary Heart of the Book of Exodus. And really, the idea is basically this, that God has created these people for his name's sake, right? The people of the earth rejected God. And we see that in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But through Abraham, God created a people for himself. And that people, he was going to bless them and whatnot. But we know that blessing of these people was meant so that they could bless the nations. It was through those people that God was going to make himself known to the entire earth. And so we learn something about God in Genesis for sure. God reveals himself to the patriarchs, and Jacob wrestles with God, and God does these things that we couldn't imagine, like allowing a 90-something-year-old woman or a 100-year-old woman to give birth, and the events of Jacob, or I'm losing my names here, Isaac and Rebecca meeting each other are bizarre. Same with Jacob and Leah and Rachel and all those people. So God is all over the book of Genesis, but in Exodus, we're going to learn something new, especially over in chapter, 3, when he reveals himself as I am. It's this idea that God is a redeemer. God is a rescuer. He is someone who takes unlikely situations and saves. So he's making himself known in that way to nations, that he is the God who saves. And we're going to see that in a big scale as God brings Israel out of Egypt, but we also see it in a small scale through the life of Moses, and what he does in this first chapter here. Or is it the second chapter? I'm confused because I've written 2 chapters so far. Oh no, it's the second chapter, so don't even think about that. But we're going to see that on a small scale in Moses's life. And that is very relevant to us now. I hope we see this through Exodus as we live in this world that is unknown and scary at times, that God is the one who reaches into our darkness and brings light. He is a God who saves when it's unlikely. So with that in mind, we'll dive in here, but that's my intro to Exodus. Okay. I have some stuff there about you getting started. I'll let you read that for yourself, but do take a moment to discuss COVID and some of the safety guidelines that we're going to talk about at the leadership retreat. We'll be giving you something on paper or digitally for you to have, but acknowledge that there's going to be different viewpoints in the room, but we must just do what's best for everyone here. What the university is telling us to do, what our public health officials are telling us to do, we need to be above reproach in that way as well, to not stir up any unnecessary negligence. So there's that. As for Exodus, it's the second book in the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses is likely the author of much of it. It's not really that important, to tell you the truth, although people always want to talk about it. It's clear that some parts are not written about him. I say they're like such as his death. This isn't really a problem. Well, Moses is the author for all intents and purposes. I just talked about what the book of Exodus talks about. God bringing his people out of slavery to Mount Sinai to give them the law, and he's going to create for himself a people. It's what I like to call them his showcase people. He's giving them a law. He's teaching them how to live so that the world can look at them. Like, think about a trophy in a showcase. Look at them and see what God is like by the way that they treat each other. That's very important. We see that in the New Testament as well. Now, don't take the term showcase too far. We don't want to just be a showcase in a church where we're sitting in a case and we don't get out of it. That's not it at all. God, of course, takes them to the midst of the people. He takes them to the crossroads of the world and shows them off in that way. Exodus 19 is going to become very important for us understanding who they are. And First Peter recaptures that language to show us who we are as the church. So there's that. Exodus answers the question, who is God? And it's going to view history through a theological lens. So there you have it. What else do I need to say? Yeah, that's what the book of Exodus is. This book is supposed to show us who God is, what he's like. He's going to make himself known through his people. We've talked about that. So let's dive into the text itself. Verses 1 through 7 is your first chunk. By the way, I'm going to have you, I think, reading almost every verse of Exodus. I'm not sure that I'll have you read all the details of the law, but I do want you to read almost all the narrative, at least, because I just think it's important. It might take a long time, more time than usual to read, but I think there's great value in just hearing the story together. So this week is just chapter 1. We're going to read the first 7 verses, and we start basically with looking backward. These are the sons of Jacob. We know about Joseph. Joseph died. I say in my study to see the video if you need some guidance. What you need to know about Joseph is that he was one of the 12 sons of Jacob and Jacob's favorite son. And Joseph was basically left for dead by his brothers. They hated him. They envied him. They threw him in a pit. I guess maybe a well. I don't know what it is. But basically left for dead. And then they decided to have mercy on him and sell him to slavery into Egypt. But God turned Joseph's life. I always do that. Turned Joseph's life around and eventually took him from being in prison with the situation with Potiphar's wife, took him from being in prison to being Pharaoh's right-hand man who took care of Egypt during a plague, or not a plague, a famine. That's the word, during a famine. And what happened was that ended up enabling Joseph to take care of his father and his brothers, and the land and the people of Israel is not squashed out because of this famine. So what you see at the end of Genesis are those kind of famous words. It's in verse 19 and 20. But Joseph said to them, as his brothers are kind of afraid that Joseph is going to kill them or something after his father dies. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." We learn from God's character there right away who he is. He is a God who sees all the wickedness, sees all the badness, the evil in the world, and he comes right into those situations and makes beauty out of ashes. And that's just who God is. He turns death into life on the cross and the resurrection. And we can see that Romans 8:28 has a similar idea that God makes good, intends good for those who love him. All things work out. I'm struggling today. All things work out for the good of those who love God. That's not to say bad things don't happen, but we can see God redeeming bad situations. Now, it's difficult to believe that sometimes, right? It's very difficult to believe that. However, we can see through the Bible that God does this consistently. And we know what the end of the story is. And so we can believe that in our lives and by the end of history, all things will be good for those who love God. And we can believe that based on not only what he's done for us, but what he's done throughout history. This book of Exodus should be a great encouragement to us in that way, that despite not even being able to see, even if the future seems very unclear, we can see that God is good and makes beauty out of ashes. So in the first 7 verses of Exodus, we are just basically looking back. Moses has quoted part of Genesis to begin Exodus. These books are tied. There's a relation here. So Joseph is dead. All his brothers are dead. And then please note the creation language in verse 7. Something beautiful here about God creating and rescuing his creation. But I'm not going to focus too much on that this week. So then I'm going to have you read the rest of the chapter, 8 to 22. should read pretty smoothly. This is a story about Pharaoh oppressing Israel. So talk about that. How Pharaoh was oppressing them. There's a number of examples in there, but verse 8 is interesting because it says there was a king who did not know Joseph, and that's important because this Pharaoh did not know who God is through Joseph. He did not see how God had prospered his people and taken care of Egypt and Israel. Had he known that, maybe things would have been different. Maybe not. This Pharaoh doesn't seem like a super great guy, but um, that's important to note because for us, we must, just like Pharaoh did not seem to know the not too past actions of God. When we forget what God has done, that can influence the way we live for better or for worse. So it's just an important thing there. You know how your parents will, people will say like, "Oh, history repeats itself." If you don't know history, it's kind of true. If you don't understand who God is and what He's done, we can become really overcome by trials. But when we know who God is and what He's done, we can stand firm. Pharaoh's motivating factor in his actions against Israel was fear. You can see that throughout here. He is afraid that they are going to multiply and be fruitful. I think it's amazing that he's trying to oppress them, and yet they grow up under that oppression. The church always seems to do that, which is just God's I don't know. I just think it's awesome. I don't know how to put it, but I just think it's amazing that whenever people try to squash the people of God, they grow. And the same thing is happening here. So he is trying to cut them out. He's afraid that they're going to, I guess, pose a threat to him. It doesn't make a ton of sense because they're his workforce, right? But he's acting nonsensically because of his fear. And in the same, I'm skipping ahead. Okay, the Hebrew midwives are in a great case study here. They show amazing faith here by just doing what they know is right at their own risk. Really, they could have seriously been in trouble, and they lie in here, which is interesting. You don't see perfect people, but it's kind of like, if there's such a thing, it's kind of like a holy lie because they're trying to keep people alive. I don't know if they should have lied or not. I have no answer to that, but they keep God's people alive. They keep these babies alive. Now, the point here is that faith calls us sometimes to act in ways that are at odds with how society or our rulers tell us to live. This can become a very politicized question. Try not to let it go too far that way. But what does this look like today? I wouldn't say this has much to do with masks or COVID stuff, but it does have something to do with the rights of the unborn and other things like that, and how we interact with some policies. But really, just at large, how does the gospel, how does the life of faith put us at odds with society? And I think it's in a number of ways. I think one thing that's important to note is that it feels like God is not in this chapter. He comes up a couple times, and we know that he is working. But in the way the chapter is written, and probably in the experience of the people, it likely felt that God was not there because their life was so horrible. It had been several hundred years, and I don't know. It's very easy to feel like, man, that was all a myth. Because they lived a long time ago. That's some old religion. Yeah, I don't know exactly what they thought, but man, when suffering is happening, it seems like God is not there, and that's common to our experience as well. And sometimes we feel that way today. Now we have the benefit of knowing the story, especially there at the end of chapter 2, that God is listening. God does hear the cries of His people. But put yourself in their shoes. Sometimes we are in their shoes right now. It is difficult to believe in God, or that God is good, or that God cares, or that God's listening, when everything in the world seems to indicate otherwise. I love this quote here, so I'll read it. Israel's political fate is never left to the caprice of international events. Rather, God is in control, and He will, sooner or later, bring all history to its proper conclusion. It is maintaining this big picture that is the mark of the mature Christian life. We doubt and we struggle, but we trust God. Things are not the way they ought to be, but we rest in God's promises. We have faith. Look, everybody doubts and struggles. Please be honest about that. I doubt and struggle. I have seasons of just horrible discipline spiritually. I mess up. Look, everyone goes through this. To be a Christian is not to be perfect or to have no doubts or to have great doctrine. Faith has to do with trusting God, resting on his promises, and acting accordingly, even when things just seem like they're horrible. We live by faith, not by fear. And I think that's really important to recognize here. I have some questions about that. We do see a glimpse of God's sovereignty in these passages. I point out verse 12 about how even you see God working in the middle of this. Even in the, I also going to point out how God was rewarding the midwives. He's still at work behind the scenes, and we should do what we would do well to notice God's hand even when things seem dark. So I'd like you to end by considering how God might already be bringing beauty out of ashes, how you've seen his hand to encourage one another. I have you closing with a challenge, which is simply to take time to write a prayer to God this week and just put it all on the table before him. I hope you'll take time to do that. I'll join you in that. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, I just talked a lot to introduce, but please let me know. I'd love to talk about Exodus with you. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon.